centuries. Virtually nothing survives from the Danish invasion in the 9th century. The early period shows Celtic and Roman influence rather than any indigenous Anglo-Saxon style. One of the best examples is at Brixworth, Northamptonshire, where bricks from a Roman ruin were used by Anglo-Saxon builders to make a simple, large windowed, rectangular building with a semicircle recess at one end, a Roman aspidal basilica. Other examples are the crypt at Hexham, Northumberland, where the abbey was built by Wilfrid in the 7th century, using stone from the ruined Roman townships of Hadrian's Wall, and the crypt at Ripon, Yorkshire. Most of the remaining Anglo-Saxon churches belong to the second phase, the 10th and early 11th centuries. Few of the smaller Anglo-Saxon churches survive intact, though more than 200 churches still have pre-conquest work in them. The typical Anglo-Saxon church has a simple plan: 2 rectangles of unequal size linked by an arch, with the smaller rectangle to the east. An additional chamber or porticus could be attached to the church. Sometimes there was more than one, as at Bradwell, Essex. The buildings tended to be of a much greater height than width, as at Bradford-on-Avon, Wiltshire. The windows were small and round-headed, set high in the walls. Interiors were often decoratively painted with little architectural ornament. The external decoration was often elaborate, usually pilaster work, vertical strips of stone on the outside walls. The exterior might also have round-headed or triangular blank arcading, a series of arches against a blank wall. The Norman genius found its finest expression in architecture. Although the conquerors destroyed the great English churches, they raised on their ruins some of the noblest buildings still extant. The Norman influence in building was at work well before the conquest. Westminster Abbey, built by Edward the Confessor, 1042–66, last of the Saxon kings, was Norman in style. So here we have St. Mary's Church at Dover, a 19th century engraving depicting one of the few Norman towers still standing. fragments of the roof of Henry VII's chapel in Westminster Abbey, where the functional ribs evolved into an intricate web of stone decoration. Though this period saw much splendid ecclesiastical building, the great castles that survive are mainly of later date. The first Norman forts were simple earth mounds with ditches and palisades, and it was not until the 12th century that stone castles began to be built in any numbers. Their characteristic feature is the square Norman keep, combining fortress and residence. Two examples survive from the 11th century: Colchester, Essex, and most famous of all English castles, the White Tower in the Tower of London, completed by 1097. Although the White Tower has been altered, its form is essentially as it was, a four-storey building divided by an internal wall into two parts. One half of the building was again subdivided to the plain but beautiful chapel of St. John, which is the oldest complete Norman church in England. Sculpture, rise and fall of styles. Monumental carved crosses erected to commemorate persons or events long since forgotten are found mostly in the north of England and the kingdom of Northumbria. Apart from a few crosses in the Midlands, no comparable sculptures of that period can be found anywhere else in Western Europe. The finest examples are at Ruthwell, Dumfriesshire, and Bewcastle, Cumberland. They date from the late 7th and early 8th centuries. They are carved with a fine leaf decoration and figures of Christ and the saints. The artistic tradition that produced the crosses declined as the Northumbrian kingdom declined. The sculpture produced in the south with the rise of the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex was different in character. The carved reliefs at Bredon on the Hill, Leicestershire, of 750 to 850 include a magnificent figure of Christ with decoration of grotesque beasts and figures intertwined with fine tendrils. The workmanship is accomplished and indicates the existence of a flourishing court school of sculpture in the kingdom of Mercia. The same can be said of outstanding works produced in Wessex to later period. The late 9th century carved stone at Codford St. Peter, Wiltshire, the Flying Angels at Bradford-on-Avon, Wiltshire, and particularly the Great pilasters of St Allsom's Tower, Canterbury Cathedral, from John Britton's Cathedral Antiquities of England, 1815 to 35. And here is a Norman carving. It was usually in low relief until the axe was superseded by the chisel in the 12th century. The font at St Michael's, Castle Frome, marks the new freedom offered by this change of technique. And here we have relief carving in whalebone on 11th century Adoration of the Magi. A lower frieze features a hunting scene. And this is a page from the Lindisfarne Gospels book, a full-page miniature of St Mark from the AD 700 Illuminated Manuscript by Bishop Edfrith. Vellum and burnished gold. Until the 12th century, graphic art in England is represented solely by manuscripts that were illuminated, that is, painted with pigments whose effect could be enriched by burnished gold laid on the vellum, or else illustrated with line drawings. The subject matter of this art was almost exclusively religious, and its aim was to illustrate and enhance the sacred texts of the Church. Illuminated manuscripts are the most perfectly preserved of all the works of art left to us by the Middle Ages. Huge numbers of manuscripts were destroyed in the Reformation, when a coloured initial was enough to convict a book of idolatry and condemn it to the flames. But the quality of what has survived shows how the English excelled at this exquisite art. Outstanding among the earlier manuscript treasures in the Lindisfarne Gospel book in the British Museum, Lindisfarne was the great monastery on Holy Island off the coast of Northumberland, founded by St Aidan and his Irish monks from Iona in 635. The Gospel book is the most splendid monument of the Anglo-Irish civilization, which developed in Northumbria after St Aidan's mission, and was written by Edfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne, 698 to 721. The stylized miniatures of the four evangelists reflect a classical influence, evidence of a traffic in books and artistic ideas between England and Southern Europe at the time. The decoration derives from contemporary metalwork, like the Sutton Hoo buckle in the British Museum, and there it is down there, and consists of geometric and interlaced ornaments, interwoven with strange ribbon-like animals into a complex, many-coloured network. The freshness and delicacy of the colours and the intricacy of the workmanship are unmatched in any other manuscript except the later Book of Kells, that's at Trinity College, Dublin, which was possibly written at Iona itself between 760 and 820. When the Vikings sacked Lindisfarne in 793, the monastic life of the north was disrupted, and the production of manuscripts seems to have ceased until southern England became united under the Wessex supremacy of Alfred the Great over 100 years later. The art that revived in the 10th century, though no less brilliant than its Northumbrian predecessor, was different. It drew its inspiration, motifs and techniques from the schools of illumination that flourished in the Holy Roman Empire, established by Charlemagne in AD 800. By the late 900s, English artists had adapted these Carolingian ideas to their own taste and talent, and founded the Winchester style of illumination, one of the greatest achievements in the history of English art. Its characteristic features are a luxuriant and fine historiated initial letters, decorated with figures of men and animals, and inhabited scrolls showing arabesques of foliage with animals inhabiting the branches. During the first half of the 12th century, a new style, the Romanesque, entered the country. This grew up alongside the surviving Anglo-Saxon style. It derived from Byzantium and the East, and its characteristics were firmness of line, boldness of execution, and a rigid monumental dignity in the portrayal of the human figure. A rare example surviving from this time is the wall painting of St. Paul and the Viper in St. Anselm's Chapel, Canterbury Cathedral. The most important English contribution to Romanesque painting is the development of the technique of pictorial narrative and of a complete cycle of illustrations to the Bible. These appeared in the enormous ceremonial Bibles which were produced in the 12th century, in particular the Winchester Bible at Winchester Cathedral, the Lambeth Bible from Canterbury at Lambeth Palace, and the Berry Bible. This is at Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. The Winchester Bible is 4 volumes measuring 23 by 16 inches and has claims to be the finest. It was probably begun in 1160 to 70 and is the work of at least 6 master illuminators. Its design, not completed, called for an elaborate initial letter at the beginning of each book of the Bible and several full pages of illuminated illustrations. These magnificent Bibles are the greatest achievements in European painting in the 12th century. At the end of the Norman period, they won for England the preeminence in the graphic arts, which in sculpture belonged to France, when bishops were metal workers. The metal work for which England was famous was a monastic craft until the conquest, and was mostly done for the church. High-ranking churchmen practised these crafts. Both St. Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, and St. Ethelwald, Bishop of Winchester, were skilled metal workers. Among the best surviving examples of the craft is an elegant silver bowl of circa AD 1000 from Hopton Moor, Lancashire, in the British Museum, decorated with low relief figures in a Byzantine style, and metal objects decorated with interlace and scroll ornament found in a hoard at Trewhiddle, Cornwall, circa 875. Not much early Anglo-Saxon jewellery remains, but the Sutton Hoo treasure of the early 7th century in the British Museum includes a large and splendid jewelled buckle and other objects. There is little surviving work as good as this, apart from the magnificent Alfred jewel of circa 880 in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, which was perhaps a brooch or part of a sceptre. It is pear-shaped, made of enamel in a gold setting, and has on the obverse a figure bearing 2 sceptres in fine Croisine enamel, and an inscription in Anglo-Saxon. Alfred had me made. 2 other jewels, less fine but still evidence of a vigorous and inventive craft, are the Minster Lovel jewel of the late 9th century in the Ashmolean Museum, Oxford, and the Dowgate Hill brooch of circa 900 in the British Museum. Among the textiles, the exquisite Anglo-Saxon embroidery known as Opus Anglicanum was prized throughout Europe. Only one example from the Anglo-Saxon period is left, the St. Cuthbert vestments in Durham Cathedral, placed in St. Cuthbert's tomb in 934 by King Athelstan. The best known represents one of the earliest narrative sequences in Europe. There are other fragments at York and Lincoln. So, apart from the gold buckle, Anglo-Saxon engraving, part of the Sutton Hoo treasure, we have Caedmon's hymn. Here, this is a page from the poet 11th century book, illustrating the Genesis story of Cain and Abel. The hymn is Caedmon's only surviving work. And then here we have a 12th century plaque, a colourful early English enamel of St. Paul being lowered from the wall of Damascus. And down here is a musical instrument reconstruction of an Anglo-Saxon harp with a tuning key inset from the Sutton Hoo treasure discovered in 1939. So next time